Hello Internet, welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm. At this point you know what this show is about, so let's just get into it. It was supposed to be two shows mushed into one enormous show. That didn't really pan out, so you may notice a little bit of changes in the audio here and there as I splice things together. And we'll talk about that stuff at the end of the show, which yeah, I don't know what else to say. So let's just get into what I recorded previously. And yeah, I recorded most of this a couple weeks ago, so it's a little bit more upbeat than some of the other segments, and we have some things to talk about at the end of the show, which is a little darker, but we'll get there when we get there. So first up today, I just wanted to mention that there has been a performance boost from PR Harvey. Now, I absolutely know and understand nothing at all about performance optimization, so I can't really talk, in detail about what was done here. The premise of the PR was that doing things in the TCL was terrible because there were so many enemies that resulted in a lot of slowdown. So this person did some sort of wizardry, and now there's a noticeable speed up in those areas. Now, I can't really speak to how much faster it is. There are some numbers in the PR, but I imagine it will vary from save to save. Now, the point is that someone worked on this and had actual results, and these sort of performance optimizations are always welcome. Next up today, also from PR Harvey, we've got the ability for techniques to trigger on reach attacks. So previously, due to limitations, no techniques would ever trigger when the player used a reach attack, despite the fact that several martial art techniques seemed valid. Now, this PR made it so that martial arts techniques can have one of two new flags which will allow for this to happen. There's one that marks a technique as usable with a reach attack, and another that allows techniques to only trigger on a reach attack. Now, the only attack I know that only triggers on reach is listed as a rapid attack for Sojutsu. Now, since it's a new flag, I'm going to assume this is probably the only thing in the game that currently works that way, but it's there now so it can be expanded on. Now, regardless, this is a good change that should benefit quite a lot of players, since we all love our reach weapons and many people really like the martial arts. Moving along, next up today from Karim Baba G, we've got a change to the Picky Eater trait. Now, it was pointed out that Picky Eater only applied to foods and not to beverages, and so this has been changed. Now, if you're not familiar, Picky Eaters will not eat anything that has a negative morale/joy. Now, this PR now updates it so that you cannot consume drinks with a negative joy either. Now, this is specifically negative, and zero joy beverages are still permitted, otherwise, you wouldn't be able to drink water. Now, beyond that, there's not a lot to say here. It makes a lot of sense to me, so there you go, Picky Eaters. Moving on, next up today from Terminator, we've got some buffs for Super Glue. Now, many of you probably already know that Super Glue was sort of rare for really no obvious reason. Now, it's a relatively common household material, and bottles generally last you a while, so I think a lot of people have them somewhere in their house. Now, I do. I have a bottle that I bought like 4 years ago. It's in a drawer over there on the other side of the room. Now anyway, this PR sought to make super glue more common by causing it to spawn in more places. There were also buffs to duct tape, but I personally think that's a little less significant given how commonly that could already be found in houses in the game. Now, the areas that you're going to find super glue are pretty much where you would expect, with buffs in houses as well as a few commercial locations. It was added to some item groups that would normally spawn things like, my instinct here is just to say miscellaneous crap. I don't really know what else to call it. So I mean places where you would find batteries or duct tape or old phones, sewing kits, that sort of like random stuff that has some value, but it's generally more common. Anyway, it's a buff to superglue spawns, which makes sense to me given how rare it was, so happy to see that change. Anyway, moving on, next up today from StubCon, we've got some door locks added to certain vehicles. Now, we talked about the addition of door locks a while ago when they were added and just kind of the gist of how they worked. Well, this PR added them to some vehicles that you would expect to have locks. I mean, I guess technically every car should have locks, but I don't know. What I mean is things like the prisoner transport, the armored transport, limousines, and luxury RVs will now have these locks. Now, I was very concerned when I first saw this because there's no easy way to circumvent locks if they spawn already engaged. Lockpicking was the main way that I remembered from that initial PR, but you could also smash the door and use the vehicle critical screen to uninstall the parts necessary to gain access. None of these options are easy or fast. It depends on the door and your weapon for smashing, of course, things like that. Well, anyway, I expressed some of my concern in the PR, and then Terrorforge responded that they do not spawn locked and instead are just really there for players to harvest the parts for their own vehicles. So my initial concerns here were not valid. You can now find these locks on the vehicles I mentioned, and you can harvest those parts to install on your own vehicle. Next up today from Inogenous, we've got the ability to scan multiple books at a time to store them in your tablet or smartphone or whatever. Now, if you're not familiar, some electronics allow you to scan books into them, effectively storing a copy of that book for easy access from that particular device. It's a great feature, but previously you had to scan books one at a time, selecting a new book each time the scan was finished. And this was a bit tedious, as Cupidatus pointed out in their feature request. Well, now, thanks to this PR, these books can now all be selected at once, and your character will then scan them one after the other. This removes the need for many more key presses and makes the process smoother overall. There's literally no downside to this. This PR is all upside, and yeah, it seems pretty great. Moving on, next up today from Spar, we've got a change that makes it so that players can no longer staunch a bleeding wound with their hands when they're driving. Now, this applies to both handlebar and steering wheel vehicles. Now, the idea of staunching a bleeding wound is that you're using both hands to clamp down on the injury and apply pressure to hopefully stop the blood flow. Now, in order to do this, you have to drop your wielded weapon, because indeed it's intended to represent you really making an effort to apply pressure with both hands. Now, by this logic, you should not be able to do this while you're driving. With your hands on the wheel, not to mention your focus being on driving the vehicle, that would basically make this impossible to do effectively. Another thing added in the PR is a simple message that tells the player they could staunch their bleeding if they were to stand still. Now, this ability to staunch wounds was never explained anywhere in the game as far as I know, and it just required you to know that this was a mechanic or somehow stumble into it blind. And since most players typically are wielding a weapon, it was very hard to just randomly come across this feature. Well, now, as you bleed, if your bleeding is low enough that it could be staunched with your hands, you will receive some occasional messages about how you could stop and apply pressure. So yeah, you can no longer staunch bleeding wounds while you're driving. Really not a lot to say about this, although bleeding in a car did make me think of Reservoir Dogs, which I should probably watch again. It's like one of the better Tarantino movies. Anyway, moving on, next up today from Terminator, we've got some expansion to where bronze and bronze recipes will appear. Now, to make this quick and simple, the chunk of bronze recipe was added to several more books, as it's a pretty common material. It was added to 3 books that deal with historical weapons and armors. Additionally, there are now 2 new books specifically for bronze-related things. One is the Bronze Age Encyclopedia, which contains a large number of bronze recipes. The other is Historic Warfare, the Bronze Age, which is a magazine and contains a lot fewer recipes. Anyway, there's really not much to report on this. It should make bronze recipes and the ability to craft bronze itself a lot easier to come by, and that's a good thing. Next up today, we've got some changes to wax from Carol. Now, I don't actually have very many opinions on this, but the PR started with a sentence that said, quote, "I was incredibly annoyed that I could eat the wax rings around toilets. And if that doesn't merit talking about, then I don't know what does." Basically, old wax is now called beeswax, and it's no longer edible. There's also a new wax called paraffin wax, which is basically identical to beeswax, but it's a different item. Toilet rings are now paraffin wax, and beeswax is limited to things that use beeswax, which seems to come only currently from hives and apiaries. It would be nice to see this applied to some candles that you could find in the game, things like that, but it's definitely not a big deal. Carol also expressed that they don't know much about working with or crafting with different types of wax, so it wasn't like a major expansion of wax usage or anything, and at present they're basically interchangeable. If there is more to this PR, I didn't really see it, so yeah, 2 types of wax, neither of which are edible any longer, and no more eating toilet rings, which is a very sad thing indeed. Moving along, next up today, we've got some frog additions from the Saddest Goomba. Normally, I would take a look at each of these creatures and sort of review them for what I think about, like how strong they are, or what their theming is, or etc. But since this is probably going to be a pretty big show, I'm sorry, I'm just going to gloss over a lot of this. Now, we talked about an expansion to frogs previously previously, which added a lot of smaller, like slightly weird but not like fully mutated frog creatures. Now this PR sought to create some of the larger, more monstrous variations of those frogs. It added new enemies, which had appropriate babies and eggs added as well. It set up weak points for amphibians, and it made harvest entries for them, as well as fixing up some of their monster spawns. Now I'm generally pretty nervous whenever I see a large number of new enemies that are being added all at once. I find that people struggle to balance creatures, and they tend to be like really OP in one regard or another. And it really doesn't help that the one creature I did actually look at was called the Great Beaked Toad, which had what appeared to be a 5 cooldown 40 damage attack, which seems completely bonkers to me when the enemy also has 400 HP. But I think that's a very late game evolution, and I really shouldn't judge them all based on that. So like beyond that, I didn't really look at these in detail, as I said. Anyway, let me know what you think of these if you've seen them, and the link to the PR of course is in the description if you'd like to explore these new creatures for yourself. Next up today from E. Hughes Baird, we've got some changes to foldable solar panels. I actually had someone DM me about this on Discord, which by the way, if you ever DM me and I don't respond, it's not personal. I basically like never look at those requests and then forget they exist. But anyway, there was a lot of discussion in these PRs, and I'll admit I'm a bit confused because it looked like people arguing, but from what I could tell, it looked like ground-mounted solar panels were made better overall. So if you deploy a solar panel using the appliance system, it will be better than it was before. And then this PR made foldable solar panels their own unique item rather than being constructed from our, the big standalone solar panels. And these come in the form of the quote folding solar panel, which is based on a small and portable camping solar panel, and also a solar suitcase. And the solar suitcase is again a very small and portable solar panel like a briefcase. Now these are based on real-world items and are no longer just a hacked-together foldable version of a big solar panel that we made up for the sake of having one in the game. Now I saw a great deal of discussion about this, like whether they should be more powerful than they are, or how they should interact with vehicles, as in how do they get installed on a vehicle when they're notably worse than regular solar panels you would rip off the top of a building. But they're not designed for that. They're not meant to be put on the vehicle roof or on top of a building. These are meant to be small versions of solar panels, like the real world items that exist. One is meant to be taken on a camping trip, so it has to be small and portable. One of them is designed to be like unfolded from a briefcase. It's meant to be set up somewhere so you can have a little bit of solar energy. These are not big solar panels. They're not meant to be like powering a whole base or anything like that. So I don't fully understand the arguments in the PR. Basically, when you find these items in the game, you will activate them, which will then deploy them as a stationary vehicle. You would then hook that into your power grid or your vehicle using cables and things like that. I also saw a lot of discussion like in the theme of like why would I ever use these when regular solar panels are better? But I don't see any issue with both forms of these existing, and you of course could choose whichever best suits your purposes or whichever you find. Like I said, I'm pretty confused over the arguing. I don't understand why these small portable versions can't exist alongside the big static ones. They serve different purposes and both exist in real life. I don't even know if I conveyed that to you correctly. I'm confused by why people are angry. What I'm thinking is that people are upset that their previous folding solar panels are now worse than they used to be, but I don't even know that that's really a problem. So yeah, probably not the best explanation I've ever given. You can browse the PRs if you want to read the discussions. I've, of course, links in the description. I'm sure you could probably dig up some talk about this on Discord as well if you're interested in searching it out or whatever. Alright, moving on. Next up today from Rewrite, we've got the implementation of a ledge cover system. Now the idea here is pretty basic, which you can see from this simple diagram in the PR. If your character is a few tiles back from a ledge, enemies on the ground probably shouldn't be able to see you. So in the most basic terms, that's what was implemented here. It uses, quote, overly complex calculations to simulate how much of a character is obscured by a ledge when viewed by a creature below. It's a pretty basic concept, and it has now been implemented. I don't know what else to say about it. I think this is cool, but I don't know how to talk about it beyond that. Keeping things moving, next up today, we've got a rebalance to various knives, and I think specifically it started by auditing bayonets. Now, this affected a lot of weapons, and I think there's two main takeaways from this PR, the things that you're probably going to care about. So first of all, weapons with bayonets are no longer capable of making reach attacks. Now, while it was discussed in the comments of this PR, in general, almost all weapon/bayonet combinations are nowhere close to the length that they need to be in order to make reach attacks. Now, I suspect that will anger some people, but there you go. Now, the other takeaway is that in addition to changing the weights and volumes of many weapons, this has caused their overall DPS to get shuffled around. Now, you can see this in the chart that's provided in the PR, where the red represents their new DPS versus the gray, which is their old DPS. Now, some of them, such as the FS knife, the hunting knife, and the Kirpan, have new DPS that is significantly worse than their old DPS. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly, I don't know how to say anything. Now, I don't know what knives previously were like the meta, and I don't know if I've ever used a bayonet in this game, so you all will probably know a lot better than I do about how big of a deal this is. This PR also added 2 new bayonets and 1 new knife. So yeah, your rifle with a knife on the end of it is no longer a valid reach weapon, and knives have had a damage audit, and there are a few more knives and bayonets than there used to be. Alright, and with that abrupt ending there, that's where we're going to end this video for now. It was supposed to contain a lot more changes, so let's talk about that briefly as well. Now, I was supposed to talk about Urk refining the NPC fleeing mechanics that we had talked about previously. He used some of the feedback he got to rework the way NPCs factor danger, which should make that mechanic a lot better overall. I also had some pawn shop tweaks I wanted to talk about, some portal dependent stuff. There are weapon proficiencies now, which I really wanted to talk about quite a bit. Now, boats will also sink if their hulls are damaged, which is a super big deal. Obviously, you could lose your boat if you suddenly sink. That would be really, really bad. And then finally, there was a whole mess of amputee stuff that I've been avoiding talking about for a long time. That's been coming out over the last few months with amputee professions and prosthetics that were added. And I don't know how to talk about that. I was going to make an episode about it, but that just seems impossible right now. But anyway, I'm not going to talk at length about those things and put them in the video like I probably should, because just things have been falling apart for me, internet. Things are really not good right now, and you may have noticed that there was no video for over a month on this channel. Now, initially I had planned to take off the first few weeks in November. For those of you who are not writing nerds, it's National Novel Writing Month, which also affectionately known as NaNoWriMo. Now, this is the time of the year where writers across the globe all feel guilty that we don't write as much as we probably should, and then we devote the month to churning out the first draft of a new novel. And I decided I was going to do that this year, and my first few weeks were very promising, and I churned out like 30,000 words, which if you don't know, most people set a goal for 50,000 in the month, so 30 is pretty good. And I was so proud to be doing NaNoWriMo for once, and that I was making so much progress, and I was even excited to share some of it with you, my audience. And I didn't feel bad taking some time off, because it was something I was really excited for, and I had enthusiasm for, and was feeling pretty good about. And then, unfortunately, my depression came just crashing down all around me. And I really don't know how to explain to people who don't have depression. It really is like your whole life just suddenly changes, and everything that you normally do just seems impossible. Every night I go to bed and I think tomorrow will be better. You'll snap out of it, but then every day I wake up and it's the same shit over and over. I have to coerce myself into doing the things that most of you do without thinking. You know, I tell myself, oh, just get out of bed. You'll feel better once you get up out of bed, and then you don't. I say, get up and brush your teeth, and at least do that much. I say, go bathe. You know, you have to do this, and sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. Everything requires so much more effort, and the whole time I feel so miserable and disconnected from the world around me that I can just not function. Even this stuff that I'm saying is like too clinical, because I scripted this. Like, it's too clinical of an explanation. It does not properly convey like the soul-crushing darkness that swallows you up when you are severely depressed. In reality, I'm a very lonely and sad man. I live a very isolated life, and I'm deeply unhappy with my job, being poor, my solitude. I feel like I don't belong anywhere, and I feel like people hate people who have depression. If you say like, oh, I'm schizophrenic, no one tells you to shut up and go away. If you say, oh, I have PTSD, then people are very understanding. They don't hate having you around. But if you're depressed, people say things like, oh, depression is a choice, or oh, just man up, or like the one I hear so much is people are like, yeah, everyone's sad, you just get over it. I go to therapy every week and it does not help. I take my medications, they don't seem to help, and I mean, honestly, I should just shut up. Anyway, I don't know when the next video will be. I'm really not very functional at this time, and I think about quitting YouTube basically every day, but I think that's just like the deep depression. I enjoy making videos, and I think when I get some like when I have a moment of clarity, I think I'll be better and I won't want to quit anymore. I couldn't even properly finish this video and talk about all the changes I want because I just can't seem to do anything. It's so frustrating to be like this. It's the same with my novel. I haven't written now in probably over a week, and I just can't. Sometimes I open the thing and I just stare at it and I can't write anything, or most days I just stare blankly at YouTube videos all day and I don't even really hear what they're saying in the video. I'm not really focused. I'm just like swirling negative thoughts all the time, sliding towards very dark thoughts and feelings. Now, I'm hoping to snap out of this and get back to business as usual, but I've been hoping that for like 5 or 6 weeks, and it has not happened. And yeah, look, this is a horrible note to end on, and I think that many people are not understanding, and they're gonna hear this, and they're gonna be like, oh, what a whiner, or oh, just man up already. I don't know. I felt like talking about it. I thought I would explain it because I feel like, to me, it justifies it. Because if someone I watched was like, yeah, I'm like really struggling right now, I would be very understanding. But I don't know how normal people feel about it. I feel like a lot of people just don't want you around when you're sad. And I'm probably going to get some negative comments that are like, bro, just shut up. No one wants to hear about this. And I don't know how to feel about that. Like, I delete those comments and I ban those people, but it's like I still see all of those comments myself. So it's like, well, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what to say about it. So I tried scripting it. It just feels very like clinical and direct. It doesn't really convey how I'm feeling. Anyway, we should just end the video. I'll be back internet at some point probably. So I just don't know when that'll be. So there you go.